Ladies and gentlemen, I get a little performance anxiety. It's stage fright here. I can't believe that I'm having this, but I'm usually doing it in my room. So here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a Kyle Larson video! This was best case scenario for NASCAR on the oval at Indianapolis. Now, all of that being said, yes, there are a ton of fishy things about this race, and we will absolutely delve into and discuss those. I don't want to totally sweep those under the rug, but if you look at this scenario, and if you were NASCAR and you were the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and you sat down and you said, you know, what's the best driver, the best situation, the best paint scheme to win this race? It's Kyle Larson. It's not even close. And if we're pretending otherwise, I would like some of what you're having. But, you know, the Brickyard 400, while certainly not 1994, although this was a celebration of the 1994 race, crowd was good today, much better than anything I've seen on the road course here. And quite frankly, this is probably back to number 2 in terms of the size of events here at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Now, I think it's bigger than pole day. I think the question would be, you know, carb day maybe close to this crowd, although I would think the Brickyard crowd was even bigger than the carb day crowd. So if you're at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, completely in a bubble, looking at, you get tens of millions of dollars of TV money to put on this race, and you get all the gravy that is the ticket sales. Well, you sold quite a bit of tickets. So from my perspective, the Brickyard 400 being on the oval, the prestige, the nostalgia, and of course now with Kyle Larson joining the winners club of this elite race, I mean for the most part, the cream of the crop wins the Brickyard 400. Kyle Larson joins that line in a year in which he also ran the Indianapolis 500, did very well there, and was also running a paint scheme that he would have otherwise driven on Memorial Day weekend if not for the torrential rain that interrupted both the Indianapolis 500 and the Coca-Cola 600 and prevented him from driving in that race at all. So I think from IMS's perspective, this was a success. The discussion later on in this video will be, was it a success for NASCAR? And I think the opinions will vary on that one. I will say the one place where, you know, there was kind of a foot shot would be that, and I mentioned this yesterday, the competition against themselves, and themselves being IMS and IndyCar, which are both under the Penske Entertainment banner. And the fact that the Indy cars raced in Toronto today, and I get it, Olympics, blah, 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 whatever you want to say. Thank God that will not be an issue next year, at least from the IndyCar scheduling side. Theoretically, you could keep the Brickyard off of an IndyCar weekend. But I think that the fact that the fan base was split, although I think the IndyCar race definitely got hurt tremendously by going up essentially directly against the Brickyard 400, both from a media coverage perspective and just a fan coverage perspective. You know, and they even spoiled the winner of the IndyCar race on the Jumbotron. They said, well, okay, well, I guess the people who are going to watch this on Peacock later aren't actually going to watch it because they're going to know what happened. And to that point, spoiler alert, Colton Herta won. He started on the pole. He led every session of the weekend. But that's not really what people are talking about, despite the fact that Colton Herta just broke a 60-race winless streak. And it's the huge crash in which, and I can say this because everybody was okay, Pato O'Ward spun, got into the wall, and then for whatever reason, a yellow wasn't immediately thrown, and Santino Ferrucci got turned into a tech deck dude, did a kickflip into the catch fence. Thankfully, everybody okay after that dramatic accident. The second AJ Foyt car to get upside down in as many weeks. Santino Ferrucci this week, and of course Stingray Robb the previous week. Again, everybody okay, but the word out of the paddock, everybody talking, my texts on my phone blowing up significantly about it. Why wasn't there a yellow flag plainly visible to the cars barreling into turn 1 at Toronto, a blind corner? and certainly a tragedy avoided at Toronto, a track which has in the past had a very tragic accident with Jeff Krosnoff getting airborne back in 1996. So, sensitive issue there at Toronto, and obviously I didn't get to watch very much of the race, so I can't really talk about much else that happened further than that. But I think that will be a talking point for weeks to come. I suppose we should talk a little bit about the racing product, and it's interesting because I thought about this yesterday and actually this morning as well. When we were talking about the Xfinity race, we weren't necessarily talking, although I did talk about Riley Herbst, the winner, and the implications for him as a winner of a race here at Indianapolis. But I think something to me that has kind of struck me about how we discuss the Brickyard versus other races is that the Brickyard, we don't go, who is going to win this race? We say, how are they going to race? And I think that's a weird discussion to have. And I'm about to have that very discussion, but I'm just curious because of the Indy 500, yes, there is discussions about what the race is going to look like, how it's going to play out. But for the most part, we're not saying, oh, it's going to be a bad race this year. We're saying, who's going to win? And I think that's something, just a thought that I want you guys to kind of mull over in the comments section. Does that kind of hurt the prestige of the Brickyard 400? We're not hyping the race up because we want to know who's going to win. We're kind of de-hyping the race because we expect it to be bad. I don't know. But with that said, it was a very bad race for about 80%, maybe even more than that. Certainly worse than the Xfinity race yesterday. Very single file. Reminded me a lot of the IndyCar race at Iowa just last week. Very much a one groove racetrack. Very, very difficult to make the outside groove work, especially later on in a tire stint. The faster cars could not pass the slower cars, particularly lapped vehicles. Guys like Denny Hamlin, Tyler Reddick, Kyle Larson got stuck in traffic and just couldn't move. Lots of fuel saving. Kind of the race you don't like to see here at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Those of us who watch races here want to see everybody fight like it's the last lap all race. Of course, it's difficult to produce that, but I think that for the first next-gen car race here at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, it's a thumbs down from a racing perspective. Now, that being said, you've read the title of this video, so you know what I'm about to say. Kyle Larson kind of saved it. Kyle Larson saved this Brickyard 400 because at the end of the day, I think this race probably on paper looks like it's more competitive than it was because of course, all the restarts that you saw, but also the stages and the strategy that went into the stages put a bunch of guys out front, and they stayed out front because no one could pass who maybe otherwise shouldn't have been in that scenario and situation. So the good news was the final stint of the race, well, the most important stint of the race, we'll put it this way, that Kyle Larson was just passing cars left and right. Mainly to the left, mainly to the inside, but it was a passing clinic from Kyle Larson. Now, granted, a lot of those cars were saving fuel. We're trying to make it to the end of the race. We're trying to, save enough fuel to also do one or two overtimes. We understand this. But the driving job that Kyle Larson did was absolutely unbelievable. And most of the passes, many of us thought this, I'm definitely included in that, looked extremely IndyCar. It almost looked to me like Kyle Larson used the lessons he learned here at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in May to great effect to win this race, because some of those passes were so late. It reminded me of sitting up in E Penthouse during a practice session at 5 o'clock at the Indy 500 and watching guys see how late they can pass each other before they get to the race. So, yeah, I mean, Kyle Larson, I think if we're just looking at the driving job, absolutely deserved to win this race. But then the Kyle Busch yellow happened, and Kyle and Denny Hamlin had been trying to do that for several laps, trying to crash each other. They finally managed to do it in turn 3, which seemed to be the problem zone when the green flag was actually out. Turn 1 was the problem zone on restarts. But Kyle Busch crashed, and it was like, okay, here's the shit show. And boy, oh boy, was it one. You had another huge crash going into turn 1, but that was not the controversy of the whole situation. It was the fact that Brad Keselowski, who looked dollars to donuts like he was going to have a shot to win at the 400-mile distance, still holding off Ryan Blaney and Kyle Larson as the laps ticked down. But when he came to the restart after that green-white checker, or the beginning of that green-white checker, he pulled off of the racetrack. That allowed Kyle Larson to get in position essentially on the pole and got such a good restart that he was able to pass Ryan Blaney into turn 1 before they crashed again. And this is a big point of contention with a lot of NASCAR fans, and I completely understand. Definitely looked to me like Kyle Larson, for all intents and purposes, jumped the restart. I think the ruling is that Blaney was the control car and Blaney technically went in the restart zone. It didn't necessarily matter how far back Kyle Larson was. Perhaps Ryan Blaney should have waited till Kyle Larson was alongside of him in the restart zone and then gone. I think that was probably Blaney's mistake, was accelerating and letting it look like he was going so that Kyle Larson could also go and ultimately make the winning pass of this race. But then after that caution, it was another restart. And again, this was where the controversy came. Kyle Larson got the run into turn 1, this time beat Ryan Blaney into turn 1 easy. But then there was a spin off of turn 2. Ryan Preece knocked down all of his tires. We've seen this with the next gen race car before. Once that flat bottom aerodynamic monster with very narrow tread tires, or sorry, narrow wheelbase tires, ended up on the ground, it wasn't going anywhere. At least it wasn't going anywhere fast. And he drove right back up onto the racetrack. It was plain as day that the yellow should have been thrown based on everything NASCAR's ever done, right? I think we can all agree with that. And yet, the yellow comes when Kyle Larson exits turn 1 after the white flag has been waved. So I can understand why people are upset, but I would say, especially in terms of NASCAR, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And this was the result that NASCAR needed. This was the result that Indianapolis needed. And I'm not necessarily implying anything here, but they got the result, right? They got the result. So you got the perfect finish. Why risk another restart if you don't have to? And to also note, I think it's another big issue with this, is that Joe Biden announced today that he is not actually going to run for re-election, which took a lot of people by surprise and some other people not by surprise. But that initially knocked NASCAR off of NBC. They came back on the air just before the green flag, but then with all the overtimes, they got knocked back to USA Network, and that's where the finish happened. And from my perspective, I think NASCAR probably said, we've got to get this race finished. I think that's a much more probable cause for the finish ending the way and the style that it did, more than some conspiracy theory. But I digress. I mentioned that this is the result that NASCAR needed. I mean, just think about this. Kyle Larson, the Indy 500 Rookie of the Year, driving the double scheme that he didn't get to race at Charlotte. He races it at Indy, and he wins in it. And another interesting note about this paint scheme, and it's kind of interesting to also tie the Hungarian Grand Prix and the IndyCar race in Toronto today, is that McLaren, or at least McLaren-colored cars, won both in F1 and NASCAR on the same day, but the IndyCar race didn't go nearly as well for them. So kind of interesting stat there. I think we need to talk about some improvements to the Brickyard 400 in the future. And while this was a great crowd, very, very enthusiastic for Larson, as you could probably imagine, I saw more Kyle Larson number 17 shirts and hats than I did Kyle Larson number 5 shirts and hats, if that tells you anything. But I think, the crowd loved the result. I don't think the crowd really loved the racing all that much. And that's no knock against IMS. I think IMS put on a great event. They promoted it. They got the crowd here. But it is now on NASCAR to improve the racing product on the racetrack. And let's just start with the next-gen car, right? That wasn't good enough. Plain and simple, it wasn't good enough. I think there's some things that NASCAR should or could experiment with. I mentioned on the NASCAR Weekly podcast, I think they should try alternate tires. You need to find some way to make the cars change over a stint and give advantages to teams for pitting and making strategy calls. You've got to do something to make it easier to pass each other. That's the biggest thing. And now, unfortunately, NASCAR has really put themselves in a pickle because they finally figured out the Xfinity package, and Xfinity yesterday proved that you can put on a good stock car race here at Indianapolis in 2024. So the Cup Series is now, to me, under tremendous pressure to do that. Another problem that NASCAR and IMS are going to have to kind of figure out is that I think one of the big things for me about the Brickyard 400 and the kind of events that work here at IMS, and part of the reason why they had such a big crowd today, is that this was a big event. Now, there wasn't the buildup, and we'll talk about that here in just a second, but this was a big event. Everyone was excited to see the return to the Oval, the return to the Brickyard 400. There was a celebration of the 1994 race. All of those things are great. All of those things are thanks to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. But next year, I would bet dollars to donuts this is going to be a 2-day event next year. You'll get a very, very short practice session, qualifying, Xfinity race, then the Brickyard 400 the next day. And frankly, people, when I did the Professor Know-It-All video, poo-pooed this a little bit, but to me, I think you got to ape some things from the Indianapolis 500, and you need to have a little bit more build-up. And I don't know how IMS could convince NASCAR to do it, but I think you need to do it. I think you need 2 or 3 practice days. We need a little bit of hype. We need a little bit of speculation. We need some data points to be able to hype and speculate the race and find out and ask who's going to win, who's going to win, who's going to do well, who's struggling a little bit. We need to talk about these sort of things. And this is something that modern NASCAR does not do very well. They don't do on track. It's all off track. It's all throwing helmets and fighting. And that's great. That's what makes NASCAR NASCAR. But here at the Speedway, there needs to be a little bit more meat on the bones. And going forward with this event, I think that's what I'm a little bit worried about, if anything, is that people aren't going to be as invested in this going forward. But that being said, Kyle Larson winning it, Kyle Larson being an Indy 500 Rookie of the Year, Kyle Larson confirming what many of us have known for quite a while. I believe Jenna Fryer was the first to report this, that Kyle Larson is going to be back at the Indianapolis 500 next year, almost certainly for Arrow McLaren. That's great. It's great for this place. It's great for the Indianapolis 500. It's great for the Brickyard 400. And so it's the best result for all parties involved. And it's a great building block to rebuild this event, or maybe a good building brick to rebuild this event into what it was prior to 2008. But I go to bed happy. I know there's going to be a lot of folks talking about the fact that Ryan Blaney probably could and should have won this race. And I will say this to you. Brad Keselowski should have won this race because he was a leader at 400 miles. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube. Obviously, Olympic break coming up for all motorsports, but I've got more content coming. Don't you worry about that. We'll see you in the next video.